everybody, Johnny Be Good here. Okay, we are now just leaving Kingman, Arizona at the Travel Centers of America here, otherwise known as the TA to many of us. Hang on while I get situated here. We gotta get going. So far I have been here for 2 hours and 16 minutes. Oh man. Whew. I tell you what, we got to get this road down the show. Road down the show, really? Or show down the road? Barbara Miller. I know you're cracking up, Barb. Alright, let's go. Blue. Caption needed, right? Abby. Where's your mama? Did you and mama call yet or not? I was in the shower. Baby. I was in the shower. Hi, Abitar. Because I'm scared of mama. I am scared of mama. Abby. I'm in bed. What are you up to? Eating what? Adobo? You mean black chicken? Can't you just say black chicken and white chicken? Okay. When did mama cook the adobo? You know, if you're not careful, it could be adobe. You know what an adobe is, right? Yep. Yep. Hi, Mama Ko. Abby, can I interview you? Because people want to know what it's like to be in high school life of a teenage girl. Come on, Abby. I'll give you $25. Yep, $25. Labing palugan na sila ni Kingman. Until now, I still didn't get a picture from Tampers. I asked her too, Mama. What would be the point? The result is the same. that picture instead. Yeah, she didn't send me the tamper picture. She sent me the snow picture. All right. Welcome to the Arizona desert, everybody. I'm going to continue to listen to John MacArthur. I invite you guys to listen to it as well. If not, well, you can mute the music, I suppose. Alright, here we go. Thank you.
Was a lot longer than it took to read it, and maybe even a lot longer than it took to preach it. Remember now, these are stories that are summarized. These are cryptic reports on these events. The conversations were longer and more extensive and more repeated. That's why you have differing statements in comparing the gospel records together. Because they weren't just one statement, one answer, one movement, one act, that's just simply a reporting of it in a condensed way. We don't know how long it took for Jesus to talk to the woman, speak to the woman, speak to the crowd about the woman, to teach. But perhaps hours. Perhaps hours. Because by the time they get to the house, pressing through the crushing crowd, the house is in a commotion, and people are loudly weeping and wailing. What does that tell you? The funeral was on in full force. So time for the knowledge of the girl's death to be disseminated, for the weepers and the wailers and the flute players, we'll talk about them in a minute, to be invited. Everybody is there, and this chaotic cacophony is in full force. And again, I see the imperturbability of Jesus in this. He just never moves in a panic. Never. He moves so calmly, so tranquilly, from one thing to another in the purposes of God. Commotion was stimulated by Matthew 9:23, saying there were flute players. And Matthew says the crowd was in noisy disorder. Now, I need to tell you folks, this is a different kind of funeral than you've been to. I've never been to a noisy, chaotic, loud funeral. In fact, typically when you go to a funeral, if you go to a funeral home, there's a sign outside the door that says, "Please be quiet. Quiet, please." People talk in whispers and hush, and everybody moves slowly, not wanting to cause any kind of disturbance, and the organ plays soft, kind of mellow music. We do funerals that way. We approach funerals in that kind of somber way in the Western world. That was not how they did it in the Eastern world, and it isn't even that way today. Let me tell you what would be going on there. We can put this together from history. Jewish funerals had three elements that would be a little bit unique for us. One, you came and you expressed your grief loudly. You shriek and howl. And everybody does that. And it is required that you tear your clothes. Okay? So when you go to a funeral, in our environment, we find good clothes. When you went to a funeral then, and you knew you were going to have to rip it up, you found something you didn't mind ripping up. This became so involved that Jewish tradition came up with 39 regulations on how to tear your clothes. So I suppose you had people talking to each other about the regulations to make sure they didn't leave anything out. Tearing was to be done, for example, while you're standing up. If you were related to the dead person, you had to tear your garment directly over the heart. If you weren't related to the person, you could tear your garment somewhere else near the heart. And by the way, the tear was to be there, and the garment was to be worn over a 30-day period, so that you continue to show your attitude of mourning. You could sew it up for obvious reasons, but originally it had to be torn big enough to put your fist through. Modest people would tear their undergarments or wear the torn garment backwards. The tradition developed that you could sew it up loosely, but it had to be evident that it had been torn. So you have people there who were shrieking and howling and wailing and weeping and ripping their clothes. Now the second element of a funeral was you brought in the professional wailers who had developed the art of howling and shrieking. They wailed, sort of priming the pump, you might say, to get everybody else wailing. Agony was magnified, not shrouded in silence. And the third thing they had was the playing of flutes. That was the most common instrument. Lots of folks could play flutes, and they all showed up with their flutes and played dissonant notes. A cacophony of things that didn't go together. So if you ever walked into an event like that, you wouldn't even believe it was a funeral. You would think it was a contemporary musical event. The very poorest of the Israelites had to have at least 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman. In fact, this was part of the ancient world. Seneca, a Roman statesman, reported there was so much screaming and wailing at the death of Emperor Claudius that he thought Claudius probably heard it from the grave. That's what was going on. Just chaos. And Jesus, in this majestic tranquility, comes in. Verse 39, entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." According to Luke, he said, "Stop weeping. Why are you weeping and making this commotion? It's pointless." Matthew adds, he said, "Get out. Get out." What's wrong? Also called Tabitha, and he threw everybody out, and then by the power of Christ raised her from the dead. This is no place for screaming, howling, wailing. Stop it. This is Jesus in this magnificent, majestic authority. He says, get out. Literally the Greek word, back out. Back out. This funeral is over. Well, those words would shock the crowd. Can you imagine? They would offend the mourners who were doing what their tradition dictated. And then the Lord explains why. He said, stop and get out. The child has not died, but is asleep. In that moment, Jesus redefined death as a temporary condition. That's why he uses the metaphor or the analogy of sleep. Sleep is a temporary disconnect, isn't it? You're insensitive to the environment around you when you're asleep. You don't hear the conversations. You don't participate socially. You're asleep, but it's a temporary situation. And Jesus is saying, for this girl, this is just a sleep. It's temporary. This is not permanent. Well, unless any of them had seen another resurrection that Jesus had done, they would have never in their life heard of anybody being raised from the dead. And they would never then have referred to death as sleep. Sleep being something temporary. This concept of death as sleep is picked up by the apostles, isn't it, in the New Testament? The Apostle Paul loves to refer to believers dying as being asleep. Like he refers in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 to all those who sleep in Jesus will be caught up in the rapture. God will raise us. We who know the Lord Jesus Christ, when we die, the body sleeps. Soul immediately in the presence of the Lord. Absent from the body, present with the Lord. Far better to depart and be with Christ. That's the soul. But the body sleeps until the glorious resurrection at the return of Christ. And so you can refer to the death of a Christian as a release of the soul into the presence of the Lord, but the body sleeps until the day of resurrection. And so death, then, in a sense, for the Christian becomes described as sleep because it's temporary. Temporary state. Well, the reaction of all these mourners, and pretty predictable, I suppose, in one sense, tells us that Jairus may have been a rather isolated believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, because they don't have any respect for Jesus at all. Verse 40, they began laughing at him. Laughing at him. And Luke had, knowing that she had died. It would be obvious. I mean, a few hours have passed. This child is blue. This child is dead. They've been there. What in the world are you saying? The child has not died, but is asleep? Jesus didn't respond positively to that kind of derision. It says, but putting them all out. He had already told them, according to Matthew, to get out, but they had not left. Rather, they stayed and mocked him, and so he began putting them out. This would be reminiscent of his cleansing the temple, wouldn't it? I don't know how he did it, but he ran them out. And he emptied the place. Their laughter was a gloating over a stupid remark, showing ignorance. It is the laughter of one who feels superior. It's mocking laughter. And by the way, if you can go from weeping and wailing and mourning in a split second to laughing, you're not really grieving. The act is over. In Luke, if you were to read Luke's words about this in the King James, the original authorized version, it's really richly translated. It's the verb kata gelao, and it translates, they laughed him to scorn. It was that kind of laughter. The laughter of ridicule, the scornful laughter of supposed superiority. What kind of a fool is this who thinks this child is merely asleep? The world still mocks and scoffs at the reality of Christ's power over death, but that doesn't limit him. in any way. Accessible, available, interruptible, indomitable, imperturbable, perfectly calm. Finally, what can I say? Kind, loving, maybe charitable if you want a BLE word like we've had. The last point here is just his tenderness, his love, his kindness. He came and displayed power. The resurrection could have simply been a power display. Say a word and it's done. But there's so much tenderness displayed in this that we see his loving heart. Back to verse 40. After clearing the house, he took along the child's father and mother. You could just see him getting them in their grief and in the silence after the chaos. He takes them literally. The implication here is that he collected them somehow. Maybe put his arms around them. Maybe he took them by hand. And he brought along his own companions, Peter, James, and John. And he entered the room where the child was. Entered the place where the child was, which tells us this was probably a prosperous man with a large house with many rooms. So he comes into the room, and again you see this tenderness, taking the child by the hand. Here again, this very personal touch, this very tender sensitivity. And he said to her, and by the way, only Mark gives us the original Aramaic. Jesus' daily language was Aramaic. That was the language they spoke in Israel. The New Testament being written in Greek. The other writers give us the Greek translation. Little girl, arise. Mark gives us the very words of Jesus in Aramaic. Talitha kum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Talitha means a youth or a lamb. It's as if he said, little lamb. We use those kind of endearing terms, don't we? We say to a little baby, you little lamb, you, when we dote over them, don't we? We don't say that after they're about 3 or so. We use other animals to describe them. But when their little lamb works really well. Really well. Now this one was still a lamb in the eyes of Jesus, and she was 12. She was 12. She was a lamb to that family. That was a term of endearment. Kum, get up. Little lamb, I say to you, get up. You get the picture? Jesus is talking to a dead girl. And Luke says, immediately her spirit returned. She was alive. Breath, inner person, life, soul, spirit came back. I love this. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. No therapy. Wonderful. I mean, how do you go from being dead to getting up and walk? And it's not just walk, it's peripateo. We say somebody is peripatetic, we mean they never sit down, they just walk around all the time. And that's exactly what it is. It's the verb pateo, to walk, and peripateo, walk around everywhere. She just got up and walked around everywhere. There was no need for rehabilitation. This was creative. She not only had life, she had all the normal strength of a 12-year-old young lady. No rehab from a terminal illness, no recovery. But that's the way it is in every single miracle Jesus ever did. There is no place in the Bible where therapists came in or rehabilitation came in to help a person who had just been healed get back their strength. Doesn't happen. Every miracle is a complete miracle. I have a new appreciation for that. Having had 60 therapy sessions just for my knee. She's old enough to walk. That's the point of telling you she was 12. She's alive. She's healthy. She can walk around with full strength. You know, the Lord could have healed her from afar. He didn't have to go to the house, did he? He could have healed her from afar. He could have said, I don't have time to go to your house. I got a lot of things going here, but I'll call down the power of God. But then something would be missing here. What would it be? It would be the tender personal touch, wouldn't it? It would be the tender personal compassion, sympathy. I call it, let's call that last point charitable. That's a word that just embraces kindness, sympathy, compassion, love, everything. And he's so sensitive, the end of verse 43, he said something should be given her to eat. Well, that's real sensitive, because once she came to life, can you imagine how Jairus and Mrs. Jairus were responding? And all the other little Jairuses that were running around there? I mean, there was some kind of reunion going on, wouldn't you think? And they were trying to process just exactly what was going on, and it was a great celebration, and it was great joy, and it was an exhilarating thrill and love flowing between all of them. And hey, nobody even thought of giving her something to eat. There's something so normal about that, isn't there? I mean, it was a miracle, but still, she is a human being in a physical body, and she needs food. She hadn't eaten probably in a long time if she had a terminal illness. The tender sensitivity of that, Jesus attending to her simplest need for food, for nourishment. Well, again, his tenderness evident. The response, look at the end of verse 42. Immediately they were completely astounded. By the way, immediately appears a lot of times in the miracles of Jesus, just to solidify the point that I've been giving to you. When he